everybody. My name is Natalie Ferdig, and I'm the federal cannabis reporter at Politico. And today we are talking about the MORE Act, which is a bill to remove federal penalties on cannabis by removing it from the Controlled Substances Act. And it will do a couple other things, too, that we'll talk about in this panel. But I'm going to let all of our panelists also introduce themselves, and then we're going to get started talking about this bill. Shanita, do you want to start?
Sure thing. Hi, everybody. Shanita Penny, founding principal of Budding Solutions. I've been in the space for about 6 years now. I am an entrepreneur, but more importantly, I have made it my business to ensure that voices like mine and others that are typically not heard are heard at the local, state, and federal level. So I'm super excited to talk about the MORE Act today.
Louis, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. They appreciate it. Thanks everybody for being on the panel today. My name's Louis Koski. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Metric. I got my start in the cannabis industry back in July of 2010 when I was still a government employee working for the state of Colorado. I ended up being the marijuana enforcement director in Colorado right as we were legalizing cannabis in the state. And I held that position for a number of years. And then left the state to do some consulting work with other government agencies around the country to help promulgate regulations and ordinances. And one of our clients was Metric, and ended up doing so much work for Metric that it ultimately made sense for me to come on board with the company as their chief operating officer. So I've been with the company now for just a little over a year and a half.
Cool. Truman, take it away.
Hi, Truman Bradley. I'm the executive director of the Marijuana Industry Group here in Colorado. It's a trade association that represents the licensed businesses as well as the ancillary and support companies. It's both the largest and the oldest trade association here. Prior to that, I built 2 vertically integrated cannabis companies here in Colorado. Excited to be on the panel today.
And last but not least, Christian.
Thanks, Natalie. Hey, everyone. Good to see you. Christian Cederberg. I'm the founding partner of the law firm Vicente Cederberg. We focus exclusively on cannabis. Started the firm in 2010. Worked with Louis on the legalization process after our firm wrote and ran that constitutional amendment to the Colorado Constitution. And since then, just been working on building a law firm that can serve clients all over the country and world. And so we have about 90 people now. My other hat that I wear is I'm the chairman of the board of the Cannabis Trade Federation and interim CEO for the time being, which is a federal, it's a 501c4 working on federal policy issues in DC. And really excited to be on the panel. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, this is going to be a great panel. I'm excited to get going. So let's start first with what the MORE Act actually does. Because reporting on this, I hear a lot of stuff, and I'm like, that's not actually what it does. So let's just set the record straight here for everybody. It deschedules marijuana. Shanita, can you tell us what that means?
Well, for me, and I think a lot of people who have looked to cannabis to actually reconcile the negative effects of the war on drugs and prohibition, descheduling is critical for achieving equitable justice, right? Critical to building equitable communities, and also, critical for education and research. When we talk about, leading and being a global leader, we can't do that until we deschedule. The siloed state markets are in no way going to ever compete with, up and coming markets like Mexico, potentially. And we've been behind the 8 ball for a long time because we haven't done what we needed to do in terms of actually descheduling cannabis, taking it off the CSA. It shouldn't be there. And, when I first got into the space, people talk rescheduling, and I thought, okay, incremental progress, but no, we've gotta get serious about this in a real way so that what the states are doing is accessible for folks getting into the industry, and also, again, actually affecting the folks that have been impacted in a real way.
Yeah, and Christian, do you want to kind of add to that from a legal perspective also, just what descheduling does? Because I think that term is very confusing to a lot of people. And
Sure.
what the CSA is also.
Sure. Yeah, the Controlled Substances Act, which is, sort of the overarching federal law that deals with controlled substances, and they have a scheduling system. Cannabis is currently on Schedule 1, which means it is, completely prohibited for all purposes. People, if you think about Schedule 2, opiates, opiates and other things are on Schedule 2. These are, as you go down in the schedule, it's more highly controlled. Then you get into Schedule 3, 4, 5. As you go down, it's less and less controlled. Descheduling means don't move it from Schedule 1, where everyone, including the federal government, if they're honest, would agree it doesn't belong, because to be on Schedule 1, it has to have no known, medical benefit, high potential for abuse, a number of other things. The other drugs that are currently on Schedule 1 are, generally the psychedelics and heroin. Cocaine's actually on Schedule 2 because it's used as a topical analgesic. So, the rescheduling versus descheduling conversation, pretty much across the board, cannabis advocates have historically advocated for descheduling, meaning remove it from the federal scheduling system so that it is not regulated as the adult use cannabis would not be regulated as a controlled substance. Medical use cannabis would not be regulated as a controlled substance. Obviously, there's got to be some nuance in figuring out, how do you treat these things if it's a nutraceutical type product or, dietary supplement. Those are the details that we're seeing play out in the CBD world, but that's the big thing: descheduling versus rescheduling. Get it off there. Alcohol is not scheduled when you talk about it for, as being used as an adult use product.
Yeah. And so what are some of when we're talking about rescheduling versus descheduling, what are the implications of that? Why has the conversation kind of turned toward descheduling rather than rescheduling? And anyone can take this question.
I just rambled on for a while, but I could just start with one of the big issues is, and again, so rescheduling, the 280E tax issue, which everyone probably knows about. For those who don't, it's if you are trafficking in a Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 substance in violation of state or federal law, then you are put in a difficult tax position as a business that's currently selling cannabis. So, any sort of rescheduling, people are like, well, at least if we rescheduled it below Schedule 2, we could get that tax benefit. The problem with that is that, rescheduling, it brings in the purview of an entirely different sort of federal regulatory agency in the FDA, as opposed to the primary regulator when it's Schedule 1, which is the DEA. It's kind of a joke, but, that's where some of the people, kind of think about this. But in general, I would say almost across the board, cannabis advocates are pushing for descheduling, as the MORE Act does.
Yeah, if I could chime in there a little bit.
Yeah,
the one thing that Christian said that really resonates with me is when you reschedule it, you do just essentially take cannabis legalization that's already kind of limited in some respects federally because of it being completely illegal under Schedule 1, and you just take it and replant it in a whole other kind of somewhat confining bureaucracy that could have some unintended consequences. And in particular, depending upon where it was scheduled, it could have some real implications for still being able to provide the product to patients, right? And so, when we think about the mechanics of implementing this type of policy, you could actually make things considerably more complex than they are right now. So rescheduling descheduling is the cleanest way to get the type of clarity that states need to run with their own respective regulatory programs.
Yeah, Shanita, not to steal your thunder, but love your perspective on it. But the descheduling, what you're doing by taking it off of the federal scheduling system, the idea is that you would no longer have the federal government using criminal actions to come after folks, no matter if the state has moved forward with a state legal program or not. By descheduling, you take that off the board.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, to take it a step further, where you have legalized and created these markets, we now have, more conversation and programming in place to actually support small businesses and minority owners, folks that have been impacted in the criminal justice system, but without descheduling, all of the resources that exist in this country are off limits to this industry. And, without descheduling, the United States continues to be a contradiction in and of itself when you talk about the health benefits that have been patented by the U.S. And then allowing it to remain as a Schedule I drug. So I think, again, it's the cleanest way for us to move forward with this. And it also just starts to really break down those historical, systemic contradictions that truly affect minority populations in this country.
Yeah, and something that you just said, Shanita just said, reminds me of, I was talking to Kat Packer, who is in charge of Los Angeles's cannabis program. And she was explaining to me that one of the, when you're talking about federal funding or federal help, federal aid that would be available to small business owners, that's not because marijuana is a Schedule I drug. She was telling me that it's very hard for her to get funding for their own cannabis small business program initiative because most of the city's funding is linked to federal funds. And so the city's existing program to help maybe people from certain communities get started, incubators get started, they can't access any of the entire existing infrastructure, which is something that I didn't even think about, would be a problem until I was talking to Kat. So just sort of to illuminate a little bit more your point there. But I want to kind of bounce off of descheduling and talk about the expungements also.
You now have a fund. If you have an expungement program, if your state is something to take the onus off the folks who were arrested and have these records, you now have a fund to do that work. We know, how old, county and state systems are and how much of a process it is, especially when you have to look at the local and then possibly a state process to actually have your record expunged or sealed. No, it absolutely does support the states that are going to go after that work.
Yeah, Truman and the marijuana industry group, you guys have been working on the expungement stuff. You can probably speak to the funding.
Truman, can you explain a little bit?
Yeah, I think Shanita's exactly right on this. A lot of these old records are still paper records. They were never converted over to digital. And so, there's work that needs to be done. And certainly there are organizations trying to put together volunteer clinics to help go through the data. But, we're in the era of COVID right now, and that has hurt budgets at the state level and at local levels. And so, if you're trying to enact meaningful change, unfortunately, you've got to find a way to pay for it right now. And the MORE Act could really help there.
And that's really important, as Shanita mentioned, because, and then you mentioned, because whatever the number is, but 99% of these convictions that are impacting people are, state and local convictions. Obviously, it's nice, whatever 1%, that whatever's out there that they're doing that, that's great. But, we're trying to, run a bill in Colorado and working with Truman and others that's going to, we did a pardon thing this year, but an expungement bill. And like the key and critical thing we're talking about is funding, right? It's low, it's 50,000 the first year, then it's up to, 500,000, then it's like 4 million. And it's because of these infrastructure problems. So that 5% tax and those funds from the federal government would be incredibly helpful.
Interesting. I didn't even realize the connection there. And speaking of funds, this bill, the MORE Act, creates a 5% tax on marijuana. Truman, do you kind of want to walk us through that and then where those funds are allocated to by this bill?
Yeah, sure. So as I understand, it's a 5% excise tax that would go on top of anything that's happening at the state and local level. And, I've thought a lot about whether 5% is the right number or not. And I think what I've come around to is because the money from the MORE Act, because the money from that 5% will go back into getting poured into the communities that have been most negatively impacted by the war on drugs, I think that 5% is actually the right number. This is not money that just gets collected and goes into some general fund, into the federal government's coffers, never to be seen again. This is money that will go back to these communities. I think that's the right thing. Obviously, especially here in Colorado, we've seen the black market just get taken out. I mean, there's really no black market to speak of here in Colorado. I mean, you can walk into any dispensary, you feel safe. There's 50 strains of cannabis on the shelf. Nobody's going to a dealer anymore. It just doesn't make sense. And so, anytime we're increasing the taxes, I do, take a look at whether or not this is going to have an impact on the black market. But in this case, I think the 5% is the right number. It will make cannabis more expensive, but it really, when you take everything that the MORE Act does into consideration, I think it's appropriate.
I know that farmers in a lot of places, I mean, not necessarily Colorado, but California, Washington State, Massachusetts, there's been a lot of problems with the taxation that they've faced and the fact that does increase their prices. The MORE Act, though, in descheduling would get rid of 280E. Do you feel like that would make up for that change and make it a lot easier and less onerous for people in the cannabis industry to foot a 5% excise tax on top of the state taxes they're already paying?
Yeah, I really do. And I know that Christian touched on 280E, but just as a former business owner, I just want to kind of highlight a couple of the things that, examples of things that 280E just really, really cripples. So 280E does not allow you to take business deductions for anything that has to do with cannabis sales. That includes health insurance for your retail employees. That includes any kind of marketing program, any kind of sales expense of any kind. And so what happens is everybody is burdened by 280E, and it really is a killer from a business perspective. It is the single biggest threat to the cannabis industry right now, and will be as long as it's on the books. And the IRS is extremely aggressive in going after these companies for it. It really hurts the small mom and pops, the folks that Shanita was talking about trying to get into the industry. The smaller the company, the more the impact for 280E has in a negative way on your business. And a lot of mom and pops are facing a tax rate that's north of 100%. And you just can't do that for very long and stay in business. So, getting rid of 280E is the most important thing outside of social justice in this industry. And so, short answer, yes, any business owner would cheerfully take a 5% excise tax if it meant getting rid of 280E. And that doesn't even count what we were talking about before, where the money goes. So it's a win-win.
I think 280E comes up more when I talk to business owners than anything else. But they also, I get asked a lot as a politics reporter, is Congress going to do anything about 280E? And my answer is always, they literally don't talk about it. Why do you guys, those of you who have sort of dealt with Congress, why is that? Why is Congress, talking about maybe the Safe Banking Act, but not 280E?
That's a hard one to say. I'll take a shot at it. I think, number one, it's hard to get anything passed in Congress right now. I don't care what it is. Even, COVID relief, which seems like it should be relatively non-controversial, has been difficult. And so, in the order of priorities, maybe it may not be fully understood. 280E is complicated. It sounds like the cannabis industry is just wanting to pay less in taxes when, what's not understood is that this industry pays more in taxes, dollar for dollar than any other industry in the country. And so I think that combination of, a difficult Congress, embattled and very bitter fighting amongst the different sides, plus maybe a complexity there, makes it hard to get anything passed.
I'll jump in real quick too. So, when we do talk to members of Congress, a bunch of them, and it's interesting, obviously, when you think about taxes, you think about sort of the Republican Democrat divide on taxes. One side, if you oversimplify it, frankly, it's lower taxes, versus, higher taxes or, taxing wealthy people more. I think the point I'm trying to make is that you can't talk about public policy without talking about tax policy. And tax policy, if you're really nerdy about policy, is where so much of the rubber hits the road. And when it comes to 280E, when we have these conversations, a lot of times it's like, oh, it sounds like business just being worried about their taxes and they're trying to get a tax cut. When in reality, what we're talking about is just literally being able to run a business, as Truman mentioned. And when you want to hire people, all these decisions that you make, it's driven a lot by, how much money you have in your bank account. And it's not just you look at the bank account at the beginning of the month, look at the end of the month. Okay, I can hire more people. Maybe I can make some more money. It's this weird system where you don't even know what your tax rate and effective tax rates are going to be. So I think there's some, I wouldn't call it fear, but, talking about it publicly, it doesn't sound like these critical issues we're talking about, which is, criminal justice reform, diversity, equity, inclusion issues, all the things that people genuinely care about. And those of us that have been in this, quote unquote industry since before it was one, and who've been, fighting for patients' rights and caregivers' rights. And yeah, now it's expanded and it's this crazy big business. So things change. But when it comes down to it, what we're trying to accomplish is a level playing field. And you can't talk about that without talking about taxes. And if you talk about healthcare and everything else, our businesses and our clients still do better than almost any other industrial manufacturing job and other things on the healthcare benefits and other things. And they do so without having to be able to expense it. It's pretty amazing thing. So the conversation about taxes, it sounds like it's a business thing. People want to immediately put it in the Republican Democrat bucket, but tax policy is public policy when it comes to this, especially.
Yeah, to follow up on that briefly, these are jobs that can't be outsourced, okay? This is, everybody likes to talk about American manufacturing and American agriculture, and that's what we have here in the cannabis industry. We have local grows, here in Colorado, down south in towns like Pueblo and others around there, those towns were not doing as well. And cannabis really came in and became a quote unquote cash crop for them. And so, this tax policy does have real world implications, not just on small business owners, but entire communities.
Yeah, real quick on the on why they're not addressing it at the congressional level. If you talk to congressional staffers, there's just not a lot of bipartisan policy that's getting done right now, and 280E would certainly need that level of support to get both through the House and the Senate. So there's a lot of challenges there. And I think too that this ends up becoming a little bit more of a complex issue than it looks like on its face. So that makes it even harder when you're trying to prioritize it against some of the other bigger federal issues that are getting raised, like healthcare and immigration and those types of things. Again, too, I also think that it's hard to start that conversation. And this is, I think, what Shanita was saying earlier is so important about descheduling. In the absence of descheduling, it's kind of hard to even start that conversation on 280E.
So I want to move on a little bit to the grant programs and the SBA loans that are part of the MORE Act, because it gets talked about, I think, the least. I think we talked the most about removing marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act and then expunging records. But these grant programs and SBA programs are also quite a lot of the bottom half of the bill, and they do quite a lot. So I was hoping maybe, Shanita, you would start us off in explaining what those grant programs are and what they do and how important they are.
I actually want to just start with, a year ago, last summer, sitting in front of Congress and testifying about why this industry needs access to resources like the SBA and naming the issues that come up. And then a year later to have the entire country entrenched in all of those issues, whether it was wildfires, if it was the robberies and looting that were the result of some of the civil unrest in different places. These were all things that we presented in a very practical way. We talked about farmers wanting to transition to cannabis and how a small business loan might facilitate that. We talked about all of these things and had no progress, right? So it wasn't a high priority. But then, and this just kind of touches back on the tax situation. Imagine being a cannabis business owner in a place like Oregon and having paid over $500,000 in taxes over the last 3 years, and then to incur a $250,000 loss because of a wildfire and have no recourse. Nothing, no support. So folks are, again, to your point, Christian, they're paying these taxes. They're doing the right thing in terms of providing great benefits to their employees without being able to write it off like any other business would. And so when we start to talk about these grant programs, we have mechanisms and resources that are already in place. And so these tax-paying businesses should have access to them in the very same way. And so I think what we've seen now with the small business bill is that descheduling, because of that testimony, I'm not giving myself too much credit, but I am going to give myself credit because I did help them understand how important it is to not just say, okay, cannabis businesses will have access. No, you've got to start with descheduling. And so with the bill starting, with the MORE Act starting with descheduling, it really gives these programs teeth. Right. And so if you're saying we're going to address criminal justice reform, if we're saying we're going to address economic empowerment, if we're going to address health and healthy food deserts, those are all the things that we want to see, because reconciling the impact of the war on drugs and prohibition doesn't just fall into a business opportunity. These communities were devastated and impacted. And so I think the MORE Act is just so thoughtful and forward thinking as it relates to what the cannabis industry can really be doing in terms of programming in our communities. And it will essentially position us with a lot of these other efforts. When we talk about the other priorities in Congress, First Step Act, criminal justice reform is not something that they're putting on the back burner. And if we can align ourselves in a way that if we can align ourselves in a way with these other efforts, I think we'll get a lot further faster.
Shanita, I would give you a ton of credit, so don't need to reserve that on yourself. But yeah, the community reinvestment piece, which, that's, reentry programs, and, this is funding, specific things for communities, because, not everyone, part of the money, it would be great to go into the licensing grant and these other, the training grants, or, small business administration loans, all that stuff. But you got to remember that not everyone just, is going to say, okay, well, great, now I want to be a part of this industry. It's not an easy business. Running any business is difficult. This one's, particularly difficult. So that reinvestment in the community, and also, talking about we talk about the pipeline to prison, one way now. So how do we work on not just people that have been impacted by cannabis specifically, but the war on drugs more generally, and just the way we've become a prison-oriented society and a jail-oriented society, of being able to use money to bring people back and help them get back into a functioning level in society is huge. And so, yeah, the different grants, I think it's very thoughtful, and there's critics and people that would do it, I'd have done it this way and everything else. But I think the thoughtfulness of it, as Shanita mentioned, is pretty amazing.
No, I was going to say, I don't think a lot of folks really understand that this isn't just about cannabis business. To your point, we're looking at funds for other businesses. We've seen, the disparities in business ownership and access to capital. Less than 1% of VCs are venture capital money is going to, Black startups and things like that. We've seen, all of these disparities highlighted. And cannabis not only gets to come in and present, this amazing medicine, but really and truly, this fund would actually help other businesses. And when we start to talk about these communities, right, everybody talks about the burden that they are on our resources. But here's the thing: once we empower and uplift them, Then we've got, again, other tax paying businesses in these communities. And now we have a tax pool for those schools, those hospitals, all the resources that these communities need.
I think the question is, does this bill do enough? I mean, in reporting on cannabis, I talked to a lot of CEOs, and it's very clear. You don't have to do a survey to see that the majority of cannabis CEOs are white, and most of them are also men. And I talked to a lot of CEOs who care very deeply about the industry, but a lot of them, maybe came from real estate or came from other places where they had a depth of knowledge, both in how to start a business, and they had a lot of money coming in. They had connections to get the capital to start, especially in states like California that have a really high bar of entry. When we look at Massachusetts, it was multiple years before the first equity applicant was even able to open their doors, which happened just a few weeks before the pandemic, then shut the doors. But we look at the industry and it's not equitable. There's not an equal number of Black owners in the industry as the population of the United States. So will this bill rectify that? When you guys look at this bill, do you think, yes, this is a way to solve this problem? Those are you faces that Sheena is making right now, so I feel like you should talk first.
It's incredible how much pressure we're putting on this industry to solve all these problems that have been around for at least 400 plus years and are systemic and have evolved to continue to oppress, right, these people. And so does it go far enough? No, we have a lot of work to do, but we have to start somewhere. And here's the reality. I am not a social equity business owner in Pennsylvania, and it took us 3+ years to become operational. It is just hard. And so, again, I think as far as the bill and what it does do, it for the first time gives us a comprehensive start to addressing each of the areas that we've identified that we need to work to improve. And no, I can't imagine that we'll ever have a bill that just fixes things overnight, because we've got a really bad, system.
Well, yeah, legislation's not going to solve this. It's good. It helps to push people in the right direction. It helps for messaging, and it helps set the correct tone. But the only way to solve this is for companies themselves to actually see having a diverse, equitable, and inclusive makeup of their board all the way down to, the vendors they hire, everything else, like making it a priority and seeing it as a true value for their company and it being good for business. I tell people all the time, I don't care if your motivations are 100% pure. What you should understand is that if you actually become, you look at these different things and prioritize these things for your business, it will make you a better business, which presumably will make it more profitable, which means your shareholders are happy, you're happy, everyone else is happy. There's just fear and there's resistance because people are scared about the initial judgment of, I'm a white male and I started this business. I didn't think about these things. I should have been more front of mind, but I didn't. And how do I get better? And I think a lot of people are afraid to sort of look in the mirror initially and start to make the change. But I think that all the work that's being done, and this bill does help. The reason this conversation is happening with a lot of people is because they're trying to understand the MORE Act and why they're prioritizing these things. So even that opening is a huge thing, but legislation's not going to fix this. It's going to be fixed by the members of these companies and the consumers of the products of these companies driving for change.
And I will say this, descheduling, again, so critical, because one of the things that we need to do is wrap our arms around the institutions in this country that do produce the diverse leadership that companies like PepsiCo and KPMG have been able to take advantage of. When we talk about this still being a Schedule I drug, you have so many historically Black colleges and universities that are just, they won't touch it. These are land grant institutions. These are colleges that were designed to support agriculture in this country. And when we talk about places like my alma mater, North Carolina A&T State University, where, just 2 years ago, we had a patent on an allergy-free peanut, you've got to think about the types of minds and just brilliance that's there. And, descheduling, I think, will remove it will help to remove the stigma, and it will make these older gatekeepers that are saying, hey, we're wrapping our arms around kids that are coming from these neighborhoods that have been affected. These are kids that will never have access to, federal student loans because they had a cannabis charge. But this HBCU, took a chance on them and said, hey, come on into our university and we'll take care of you. We'll help you get to the next level. And so I think what this bill does is start to create an opportunity for a pipeline of talent that will diversify this issue or this industry. Again, North Carolina A&T, #1 producer of Black engineers. When we talk about innovation in this industry and talent and diversity, you get it all in one stop, So I am hopeful about what the MORE Act, the direction that it will get us going in, but it will take, to your point, Christian, everybody doing their part to acknowledge where they are in it personally so that they can then that translate into their professional ability to affect this.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add here is that, let's not let perfect be the enemy of the good. The MORE Act does a tremendous amount of good. It puts collectively the nation's money where our mouth is, or at least should be, to start moving in the right direction instead of continuing to move in the wrong direction. I agree with everything that Shanita and Christian said, that, this is going to take a sustained effort, probably generational effort, to continue to have people like me who have been in positions of power, who have had access to capital, take a hard look in the mirror about our hiring practices, our vendor relationships, who's on our board, and look at the implicit biases that we have. And that's not just owner to owner, that's as an industry, it's really as a nation. The MORE Act is a key piece of this, but no, that won't be the work ending, that'll be the work getting started.
Just real quick, Truman, that's a really good point. Just to kind of piggyback on all the other points that have been made, whatever legislation ends up being first is really historic, right? I mean, the first round of legislation coming out of Congress that passes is really going to kind of set the tone for how this plays out. And so I think to a large extent, the fact that the MORE Act is so focused on the social equity piece, it almost starts to fill the gap that we had at the state level. And there's been some great work done at the state level, but state level legalization started out with the pragmatics of regulating a business and didn't pay as much attention to a lot of the social equity issues that were prevalent even at the time, right? So this bill in of itself definitely gets us moving in the right direction. As to whether or not it does enough, that's still to be determined, right? It's going to be this bill and then other bills that come past. And I worry that the 5% tax could have implications for state programs, and I also worry how much the federal government gets in and actually starts to create negative impacts for the state regulatory frameworks. But like everyone's saying, this is a step in the right direction. And I think the initial legislation that comes out of Congress is really going to set the tone at the federal level, and states are going to follow suit.
Yeah, and I think that actually kind of brings us to what the MORE Act does not do. Speaking of regulation, the MORE Act focuses a lot, it deschedules and it focuses a lot on expungements and grant programs, but it doesn't regulate the industry. Can you guys talk a little bit about, why this bill may not regulate the industry and where that might be expected to come from? Louis, why don't you take a stab at that?
Well, first of all, I always worry that public policy issues find their place to the right level of government. And again, I think I mentioned this earlier. that I definitely worry about the zero sum kind of divisive and partisan climate that's there in DC. And a lot of us that have been involved, all of us on the phone have been involved with this for a significant period of our careers, and the work that's been done at the state level, while not perfect, certainly has its merits as well. And I think the more the federal government gets involved in the regulation of it, the more potential it might have a negative impact on the state programs that are out there existing. In fact, if the federal government tries to do too much, for example, it could have negative consequences for social justice efforts at the state level. States might say, well, federal government has social justice issues covered. We don't have to worry about that now. And we want to be really careful of that, because states have an obligation to be able to address that. And some of the early adopting states are having to backtrack to accommodate and to address some of those issues that probably should have been addressed back in 2014 when I first got started. I think I always look back at the work that I was involved with back there, and I really kind of think we missed not talking about that. I mean, we just simply didn't address it.
Yeah. On the regulatory question, I mean, I think just the politics of it and other things, the regulatory structure, maybe it's controversial, maybe it's not. There's people that would say, let's follow a TTB alcohol type model. Let's look at the FDA model for food products, as a secondary regulator. Maybe it's a primary regulator because the FDA is a primary regulator of tobacco products, would probably, I think, if you just look at this bill, it was focusing on the issues that were important that they wanted to get out there, knowing that a regulatory system is something that can be cobbled together or put together following sort of the overarching statement that's being made. If you think about Amendment 64 in Colorado, the way we wrote it, we had some basic parameters, and then we set the legislature and the state regulatory agency with Lewis and others' leadership to the task of creating that regulatory structure. And then we created a super complicated, oftentimes very effective, but sometimes, the politics of it made a regulatory system that doesn't make sense in certain ways. And so we've made constant adjustments. So that, to Lewis's point about letting, how states need to be able, they've set up regulatory systems in a way that works for them. But I think the federal government's role, from my perspective, and this is the Christian Cedarberg perspective, not the CTF perspective, not even the Vicente Cedarberg perspective, but I think the federal government's role is similar to what they do with alcohol, tobacco, firearms, which is help states enforce their state laws, depending on what those state laws are. And if there's trafficking of cannabis or other problems, the federal government plays a role there. And I think the TTB model, the alcohol model, where the Tax and Trade Bureau, they have certain rules. We standardize labeling and some other things, but for the most part, having an incredibly important but relatively limited role on the regulatory side. Although I'm sure alcohol companies would tell you that it's not as limited as you might think, but having that role and then leaving a lot of this stuff to the states. And I'm not talking about States Act here. I'm just literally talking about, federal versus state regulatory systems. And I think that the MORE Act probably intelligently recognized that we can fill in those regulatory details later, but putting this important information out there about what this is really all about. And every business owner that's in this business, I don't care, you mentioned people came from real estate or came from other industries. It doesn't matter, you're in this industry now, and you cannot separate from the fact that you are selling a product that for years, decades, and more has been used as a tool of oppression, honestly. And you can't separate that from the business that you're in. So it needs to become, if you've never been a drug policy person, you are now. If you've never been someone who cares about, social justice issues, well, you're in the thick of it. If you're not thinking about this, you're in the wrong business.
We haven't really talked about the likelihood of passage here of the MORE Act, and maybe we'll get to that. But I think it's important to keep it real where we are in kind of the arc of cannabis regulation and legalization. And the MORE Act does not force states to create a marijuana program. And that's probably for the best, because, there are these levels of reefer madness that states go through where, as a program gets rolled out, as it's done successfully, the businesses partnering with the regulators, partnering with the lawmakers to make sure that we get this right, you see that stigma go down as, frankly, older folks leave elected office, newer people come in who don't have those preconceived notions about cannabis. And so, I think the MORE Act really strikes that balance of not forcing it on other states.
Yeah, that was actually my next question, was the fact that, there are other bills on Capitol Hill that maybe don't require states to legalize marijuana, but they will withhold federal funding if they don't decide to decriminalize marijuana in some way. And this bill does not do that. It obviously incentivizes states to expunge records, but it does not penalize any states. And that is kind of controversial in some circles. So yeah, I would love to hear everyone's thoughts on kind of the pros and cons of the fact that the bill does not require states to create any marijuana industry or even, stop arresting people for it.
Shanita, I saw you were going to say something before, so do you want to jump in here? Or I don't want to put you on the spot, but
I was thinking about the incentives, and I was actually thinking more about, kind of what happened in Colorado, right? So we do have places that didn't think through this or legislate and regulate for social equity and criminal justice reform and things like that. But what the MORE Act does is incentivize you, right? And so we saw states like California and Massachusetts and, say we're going to have these programs, but then they were trying to figure out how they were going to fund them. And so at least now you have a fund in place to help you get there, and a ton of models at this point, and what's been working and what's not worked so far to go on. And so I'm not a big fan of penalizing states who aren't ready to legalize, but we certainly need to level the playing field across the country as it relates to decrim, and where we can actually have the federal oversight that we do with, say, government contracting, because we do have states that have paid lip service to diversity and inclusion in the industry, but we don't see the results because it's nothing more than lip service. And I'll speak to Pennsylvania. It was all you had to do was check the box. I've got one Black person, one woman, one vet, and you were getting all these extra points in this merit-based, highly competitive licensing process. And we ended up with another state full of mostly white-owned cannabis companies. And there's nobody going back and saying a year, 2, 3 years in that, hey, those folks that were on that application are no longer a part of this organization. Those folks that were, propped up as owners don't exist. And that's where I think we fall short with the MORE Act, and where we could actually put some teeth to what we're saying. With government contracting, if you say I'm hiring 51% women and you report, something less than that, you might be given a warning. One time, maybe two, but at some point that contract is being snatched and they're moving on to the person who's really going to do what they said they were going to do. And I think that's probably where I'd see the penalty potentially. But I'm hoping that we can just move in a direction of incentives as opposed to penalties. And with so many multi-state operators, we have the opportunity to, go in and say, even if this doesn't exist in this next market, we're going to lead with it.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting, right? I mean, there's always been this push-pull with, taking modest steps, pragmatic steps versus, are you going too far? Does this go too far? Does that go too far? If you look at the history of alcohol prohibition, one of the it's credited with ending it in many, scholarly sort of, folks and others is the local opt-out, which is why, in Waco, Texas, you can neither buy alcohol nor dance legally because the state laws, don't, the federal laws don't require people. It allows every state and frankly, every locality, depending on the state, to decide. Some states have chosen to do a state-run model, so giving choice to states, there's going to be some states that might actually choose a state-run model. And it's funny because, as someone who worked, when I was working on, when we were drafting Amendment 64 and reaching out to all the stakeholders, trying to get as many people involved as possible. It wasn't about creating a huge industry. It was about stopping people from getting arrested. And we thought if we could do it in Colorado, and we've been working on, Steve Fox and others, a public education campaign since 2004, 2005. If we could tip the first domino and start to knock things down, our hope was that a series of events would happen subsequently. I think if you asked us, we probably didn't expect things to go as quickly as it did. And it's not to say Colorado was the only reason this is happening, but I think it's one of the primary drivers. But at the time, for example, the Drug Policy Alliance, my friends and colleagues of the Drug Policy Alliance were coming to us and said, you guys are going too far with Amendment 64. You're doing too much. You should pull it back. And when, that didn't happen, and when the history is written on this, Drug Policy Alliance pulled out their support of Colorado and moved towards Washington, which was a marijuana is bad, but the drug war is worse. And, their approach was much more, very much about this moderate step, did not allow for home cultivation and other things that many people now would say are fundamental principles of legalization. So I don't begrudge them for that position now, nor do I begrudge them for telling me now the opposite. I'm like, wow, the tables have turned. It's like, we need to go further. We can't have a banking law pass unless it includes, these other provisions. And like that push-pull, as long as it's done respectfully, I'm all for. But it's just funny how these things transition. We've got to be focused on getting, as far as we can, but be very practical about the fact that a lot of places just aren't ready yet. That's my opinion.
Yeah, Christian, you make some really good points in terms of, the state of readiness for when you're comparing incentivizing versus penalizing. And I think we're in that phase where incentivizing might work a little bit better in so much as that there's already kind of a natural expansion of growth of legalization across the country. And so right now, incentivizing might work a little bit better, and my area expertise is around state policy making, and I know that if you compel a state to do a regulatory model around cannabis, there's a really good chance it's going to be more focused on putting the industry down rather than creating a credible regulated framework. And so the state of mind of the government officials that are going to be putting in that regulatory framework is really important because they have a lot of discretion on how those processes play out. And so right now, incentivizing states to get them over the hill to make the decision to move forward with it might be enough to just kind of help with responsible growth across the country. That's not to say, we've been talking about the importance of descheduling, and I think if that doesn't happen across all the states, if states don't embrace that does create some complexity, but compelling them to put in a regulatory framework might not have the desired consequences that we'd like to see in the industry.
All right, well, we're running toward the end of our time here, but I just want to end asking everybody kind of what you feel that, the path forward is for this bill. I know Truman touched very lightly on this, that, the MORE Act is expecting a vote in the lame duck session after the election. It is not going to get a vote unless I will buy everybody dinner if it gets a vote in a Mitch McConnell-led Senate between November 3rd and January 1st, which is very, very, very unlikely. And then if Republicans maintain the Senate control after the election, it still also seems unlikely that Majority Leader McConnell would consider bringing this bill for a vote on the Senate floor. And so first question is, what is the pathway forward for the MORE Act? And then the second question is, what then does this tell us about what Democrats are trying to accomplish with this bill?
I'll take a crack at it. Here in Colorado, we've worked really hard to keep cannabis as a bipartisan issue. And lawmakers from different sides of the aisle, we hope, arrive at the same conclusion, namely that cannabis is good, it's safe, and it should be regulated. They arrive at that through very different kind of logic or, different lines of thought, but they get there. And so, I would say that cannabis is a bipartisan issue, and that's a message that needs to keep happening regardless of who's in power. The other thing that we do in Colorado is we try to get people on record of voting, up or down on a cannabis measure so that we can then, direct campaign funds to the folks who really want to move this forward. And so for a lot of reasons, it's important to get people on record, because that record is going to matter. And so, I agree with you. In a Mitch McConnell Senate, there's no way this is getting to the floor. But Father Time is undefeated. So, there will be a day when Mitch McConnell is not in charge there. And hopefully that day is soon for cannabis purposes. But one way or another, I think it's important to get people on the record.
Yeah, and that is not to say that there is not Republican support in the Senate for marijuana. I don't know how much longer Cory Gardner will be in the Senate, but obviously he's on board, and there are a number. Rand Paul, for example, is ready to legalize marijuana tomorrow. But Mitch McConnell is kind of the linchpin here.
I think what Truman was saying about the bipartisan issue in Colorado, that's actually been that wasn't just unique to Colorado. We've seen that in a lot of different states where cannabis is a bipartisan issue. So I think ultimately at the federal level that could happen. I go back to the current climate and how difficult it is to get bipartisan policy through Congress. That concept could very easily get one heck of a workout in DC with the current climate. So optimistic on one hand, and then also just the realistic part of me is concerned about how it can get through, especially with a Republican controlled Senate.
Hey, Shanita, do you want me to go real quick, and then you can get the last word and finish us off strong here? So MORE Act, I hope, and we're working to get, to get sponsors both in the Senate and the House, but more importantly, the House, so that there's a strong vote post-election. I think that sets the tone for the next Congress, and hopefully that sets the bar here. And then there'll be negotiations around the different things, and maybe there's some other better ideas that'll come up. And, in the negotiation with the Senate, the key is whether or not the Senate is held by Democrats or Republicans, as you mentioned. And I think even more interesting, if Mark Kelly wins his race in Arizona and Arizona legalizes, if Steve Bullock wins his race in Montana and Montana legalizes, and then Cory Gardner loses in Colorado, John Hickenlooper wins, and then South Dakota legalizes, which I think is a very real possibility. The only United States senator on the Republican side who will be in a legal state, or the main one, I guess I always forget about Alaska, but John Thune will be our guy. Otherwise, we've lost the Republicans that are in the states that have legal cannabis. So it's an interesting dynamic that's coming, but
Murkowski.
The Senate controls.
Sorry. Murkowski.
Oh yeah, sorry. That's what I keep forgetting about Alaska, and I shouldn't. It's just because they just haven't really. They're very, very quiet on this. They don't really engage on this issue at all.
She actually co-sponsors everything but the descheduling bills. I had to look this up this week.
Really?
I did not realize.
That's something I should know, and maybe we can.
She co-sponsors the banking bill and the States Act.
That's awesome. Well, we can edit this all out, right?
No, but it's good for people to realize, because I didn't even realize. So, there's election in 2 days, and that's all I cover now. So,
right. No, that's fascinating.
I think at this point, what we've seen, especially now, of course, Biden-Harris is where I want to be after November 3rd. But what we saw from Harris as a presidential candidate in terms of talking full legalization to now playing her role as a vice presidential candidate, and only talking decrim and expungement, I think it lends itself to the Democrats and other folks rallying and working with their Republican colleagues to bring the MORE Act to life. And so I'm hopeful that we'll have, folks that realize we need this. I've heard about so much economic, reliance on cannabis. And so if they're going to do that, they have to do it in a way that's equitable. And we've got a Congressional Cannabis Caucus chair who has committed to only passing equitable cannabis legal legislation. And so I am hopeful that we'll get there. And I think it's up to every single one of us to continue to make this not only consumable, but to make our elected officials really understand how important it is to pass this legislation, in addition to all of the other things like safe banking and addressing 280E.
All right, well, thank you guys so much for joining us for this panel. Thanks for everybody who tuned in. I hope it's been a great and enlightening conversation. I definitely learned a lot. Thank you, everybody.